As a child, I, like many children, had a doll's house. I didn't have any dolls. We all know dolls are creepy and they'll kill you in your sleep, but I was fascinated with the houses they might live in. And when I transitioned to the digital interiors of The Sims, a game originally built as an interior design simulator rather than a digital life simulator, the former is exactly how I used it. I liked my Sims houses how I liked my dolls' houses, devoid of people. But while these miniature spaces might instill a kind of enchantment that draws us to them, there's something equally unsettling in their diminished size. And they've been used as a catalyst for horror, from the 1963 Twilight Zone episode Miniature to Netflix's 2018 series The Haunting of Hill House. But nowhere in horror is the miniature more dominant than in Ari Aster's 2018 debut feature, Hereditary. Perhaps the most evident appeal of the miniature is that it provides a controlled environment. One that, as poet and literary critic Susan Stewart writes, presents a diminutive and thereby manipulatable version of experience. A fixed form that is manipulated by individual fantasy rather than by physical circumstance. In Hereditary, as Annie focuses her miniaturist craft on recreating scenes from her own life, including the most traumatic, she takes control of these events in a sanitized world devoid of emotion, of pain.
What? It's not about him. No, it's a neutral view of the accident.
There can be an academic association with diorama, models intended for study, objectivity, and neutrality. But Annie's eventual destruction of these replicas suggests that emotion isn't so easily erased and control not so easily granted. And, of course, the association of control in miniature can go both ways, creating a world where we are maybe not the controller, but the controlled. Ari Aster explains that Annie's miniatures served as a perfect metaphor for the situation. They're dolls in a doll's house being manipulated by outside forces. Any control they try to seize is hopeless. From the film's opening scene, which seamlessly transitions from miniature to life-sized, it's difficult to shake that shadow of miniaturization, casting the family as dolls within their own home, and mirroring a scene in Stanley Kubrick's 1980 adaptation of The Shining, where Jack studies a model of the hedge maze only for the film to cut to an aerial view of a seemingly miniaturized version of Wendy and Danny trapped inside. Susan Stewart suggests that, in its tableau-like form, the miniature is a world of arrested time. Its stillness emphasizes the activity that is outside its borders, and this effect is reciprocal. For once we attend to the miniature world, the outside world stops and is lost to us, perhaps giving rise to a fear that the miniature world might take over, and we might become lost within it. The miniature can also be identified as a point of origin. While Annie's creations are distinctly modern, Stewart considers how contemporary dolls' houses are distinctly not contemporary, referring to the dominant Victorian aesthetic of current models. Not only does the miniature evoke associations of childhood, our own personal origin, but it also evokes a return to a time before industrial production, a kind of sociological origin. Hereditary expands this further to consider the family as origin, the idea of origins as an inherited identity, something we're born into, beyond our control. This notion of heredity similarly plays into what might form the basis of the miniature's uncanny power: boundaries, specifically the transgression of boundaries. The enclosed space already necessitates a boundary between inside and outside, public and private. But the miniature space creates an additional tension between large and small, original and replica, our animate world and this other world of silent tableau. To quote Stewart again, last time, I promise, the miniature world remains perfect and uncontaminated by the grotesque, so long as its absolute boundaries are maintained. Hereditary explores a kind of familial contamination, whether it's an inherited illness, residual trauma, or a supernatural curse. But Stewart similarly positions contamination as the main threat to the enclosed space of the miniature. Maybe this is another reason for my own discomfort with dolls in the house, wanting nothing that would imply movement, nothing that would disturb the perfect harmony of the space. And I think the unease that so often accompanies the miniature comes from an understanding that these boundaries are already transgressed by our presence, our observation of this space. We disrupt the world of the miniature just as the miniature disrupts our life-sized world. But more than simply providing an easy window into a world distant from our own, the miniature might equally allow for a new way of seeing and experiencing that which is life-sized. In The Poetics of Space, Gaston Bachelard suggested that the cleverer I am at miniaturizing the world, the better I possess it. But in doing this, it must be understood that values become condensed and enriched in miniature. Platonic dialects of large and small do not suffice for us to become cognizant of the dynamic virtues of miniature thinking. One must go beyond logic to experience what is large in what is small. And these seem like the basic principles that govern not only how we respond to miniature space, but also the genre of horror, which frequently uses imagery that goes beyond logic in order to visually depict and process those parts of experience that aren't always so easy to see, in a way that might not reflect how our world looks, but instead how it feels. As Asta says of the inspiration behind the film, I was more pulling from feelings than experiences. We might not relate to being pursued by the supernatural, but the underlying ideas of grief, family, and uncontrollable forces are universal. It's just that in horror they're given a form we can see. Just as miniaturizing the world might allow us to possess it, perhaps giving tangible form to these unseen forces allows us to process the immaterial concepts they stem from. In both horror and miniature, we encounter our world through the fantastic. Referring to a whimsical description of a flower in the 1951 Dictionary of Christian Botany, which draws anthropomorphized comparisons with words like costume, feet, knees, little woman, and homes, Bachelard dictates how we are inclined to think that the narrator would have been more cautious had he had to describe an object with ordinary dimensions. But he entered into a miniature world and right away images began to abound, then grow, then escape. I think this is the appeal of miniature space and its value, as well as part of the appeal and value of horror as a genre. A space where ideas can grow and escape. A space where we can encounter the familiar through the unfamiliar. It's a space that can be as uncomfortable as it is enticing. But rather than being separate from our world, it provides a method of questioning and reconsidering it. The miniature is not just a model space, but a model reproduction that engages and challenges its life-sized counterpart. And while this tension between small and large, animate and inanimate, our world and another, might elicit unease, we're frequently drawn in by the questions it poses, and the answers that seem to lie just out of reach.